Hello there. Welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing great, thank you very much. So we're on the final part of our story, where, we're hearing all about Mrs. Beacon and her two schnauzers, who regularly took walks in the woods. And I think something is going to happen there. So we're about to find out what's going on in this part of the story. But before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with part 4 of our story. Before long, I'm delighted to say that Mrs. Beacon became a much-loved fixture and fitting in me and my children's lives. I would regularly invite her over to dinner to enjoy a Sunday night roast with us. My children loved her, and she even had a key to our house to let herself into Tumbledown Cottage if she should need anything, like a bowl of sugar or something. She would very regularly pick up our mixed-breed dog Pep, who looked like a cross between a golden retriever and a husky, and take him for walks with her two schnauzers, Topsy and Turvy. I was so grateful to Mrs. Beacon helping me out like this. One day Mrs. Beacon came back to Tumbledown Cottage in quite the panic, with Topsy and Pep at her side. She seemed eager to get into the house, but Turvy appeared to be missing. Mrs. Beacon looked as white as a sheet, but both Topsy and Pep seemed to be in reasonably good spirits, as if nothing fazed them at all. I'd never seen Mrs. Beacon looking quite so pale in all my life. I knew something dreadful had happened by the beleaguered, rather shipwrecked expression on her face. She looked distraught. Had something happened to Turvy, I wondered. I pretty much could read between the lines, and was assuming the worst. "You're trembling, Mrs. Beacon. Are you all right? What on earth is the matter? Where's Turvy? Isn't he supposed to be with you?" Mrs. Beacon said nothing, but stared vacuously into space. For a moment she looked almost like a mannequin. She seemed confused and disorientated. I grabbed her by the hand and led her into my living room, persuading her to sit down on the couch. She seemed so rigidly stiff and unyielding, sitting upright in the chair, still staring into space. Mrs. Beacon was breathing heavily. There were beads of sweat on her brow, and she shook like a baby's rattle. She was one of the strongest people I'd ever known, so to see her in this fragile, discomposed state was rather startling for me, to say the very least, leaving me feeling somewhat disquieted. I hoped that Mrs. Beacon wasn't going to tell me that Turvy had tragically run across the road and got run over by a passing car. But in our neck of the woods people drove with studious care, so driving fast down Madison Avenue was pretty much unheard of. I knew she had had some kind of a dreadful shock, and whatever it was, it had caused her great distress. Her eyes were round and almost glassy-looking, as if she wasn't entirely with me in the living room, and was replaying what had clearly just happened to her in her head over and over again, like a video on rewind. Pep and Topsy had happily settled down at her feet, and seemed pretty calm and relaxed, but Mrs. Beacon was anything but. I knew she was trying to say something, but words failed to come out of her mouth, as if her tongue had been unfortunately tied. I'm sure I heard her mutter something about Turvy, so I was pretty sure something awful had happened to her dog. I knew for Mrs. Beacon, who had never had a husband or children of her own, that Topsy and Turvy were like children to her. So if she lost Turvy, she would be beside herself with grief. And as the dog wasn't with her now, it seemed reasonable to conclude that Turvy must have had a dreadful accident. I immediately dashed over to my drinks cabinet at the far end of my living room, and from the cupboard retrieved a bottle of brandy and a tumbler. I poured Mrs. Beacon a shot of brandy. They always said brandy was good for shock. I was sure it would help calm her down. "Mrs. Beacon, drink this, it's brandy. I'm sure it's going to help you feel better." Mrs. Beacon obediently took the brandy from me and swallowed it down in one gulp. It seemed to work a treat. "I just can't believe it," said Mrs. Beacon. "I can't believe it. It's just the most dreadful nightmare. Who would have thought it was possible?" She began to dab her brow with a tissue that she had pulled out of her jacket. "Look at me. I'm sweating like a pig. And it isn't even hot out there." "You've had a shock, Mrs. Beacon. Anyone can see that." What can't you believe, Mrs. Beacon? Where is Turvey, Mrs. Beacon? Shouldn't she be with you? Turvey, said Mrs. Beacon. Turvey! A big fat tear dribbled down her cheek. I think I've lost my Turvey. I don't think my Turvey is ever going to come back to me. I think she's gone forever and ever. She's gone, Missy. At that, Mrs. Beacon began to sob inconsolably. I handed Mrs. Beacon a box of tissues, and she blew her nose and wiped the tears away from her eyes. What happened to Turvey, Mrs. Beacon? Please talk to me. Maybe we can help her. Where is she? After much nose-blowing and sniffling, I managed to pick up the gist of what Mrs. Beacon was saying. At first she spoke very fast, and then as her breathing subsided and slowed down, so did her voice. She wrung her hands together nervously, inhaled and exhaled a few times to steady herself, and said in a muted voice, I was walking down the trail with Topsy and Turvey and your dog Pep in the woods, and I let them off the leash. You know what Turvey's like. She's the naughtiest dog of all of them. She was running ahead on the trail, hoping to stumble across a rabbit she could chase. Oh, I know exactly what she's like, I laughed. You forget I've taken your dogs for walks sometimes, and Turvey's got a mind of her own. She's quite a naughty thing. Always wants to investigate everything. Isn't that right, Mrs. Beacon? You're absolutely right. Turvey is headstrong, always has been. But on my walk this morning, Topsy and Pep stood resolutely by my side. But Pep was growling, as if he could sense something was amiss. I noticed both Topsy and Pep were not enthusiastic about their walk this morning and seemed reluctant to move forward through the trees. As you can imagine, this was idiosyncratic behaviour from them, as they're always so excited about their walks, even though they're a lot more skittish than Turvey. I think Pep picked up a strange scent in the woods of some kind that he didn't like and was not well acquainted with, so he was reluctant to move forward. Topsy never likes to leave my side anyway, but even she was very apprehensive to move ahead down the Silver Gorge trail, as if she was rather uncertain about something. I had to coax them forwards, you know, while Turvey took off as usual like a rocket into space. In truth, I've never ever seen Turvey this hype before. While two of the dogs were reticent, it was like she was high on steroids, wagging her tail furiously, barking excitedly, and rushing full steam ahead. I had to call after her to slow her down, but she took absolutely no notice of me, because she can be mulishly stubborn at the very best of times. Well, I know what she can be like. You don't have to persuade me on that, Mrs. Beacon. Mrs. Beacon continued. Everything in the woods went very quiet. I've never known it to be like that before, but it did give me a very unsettling feeling. All of a sudden I heard a shrill scream. I knew it was Turvey and that she was in desperate trouble. She squealed out as if she was in pain. I didn't know what had happened to her, but it sent the fear of God coursing through every single cell of my body. It is not a sound you want to hear, your animal making. So I began to panic, and I ran towards the sound. But Pep and Topsy didn't run forwards with me, but shrank away. It was as if they were scared of something. I'm afraid I was so consumed with worry for Turvey that I didn't consider my own safety. And that was when I saw him. Oh, my God, there are no words, Missy dear. Mrs. Beacon, you saw him. Who are you talking about? Who did you see? Mrs. Beacon's eyes grew round, as if they were standing up on stalks. I don't know if you're going to believe me, Missy dear. I feel reluctant to tell you what I saw, but I promise you my eyes were not deceiving me. This thing was real. I promise you it was real. Even I thought I had to be dreaming. But I promise you I saw this thing as clear as day. What did you see, Mrs. Beacon? Whatever you saw, I will believe you. I saw a male Bigfoot, dear. That's what I saw. A male Bigfoot, I said. What, on the Silver Gorge Trail in the woods? Are you saying you actually saw a Bigfoot? Are you absolutely sure about this? Yes, I'm sure, dear. It was a male Bigfoot. I've never been so petrified. The thing was terrifying. It must have been about 8.5 to 9 foot tall. I can't be sure how big it was, but it was huge, and that's enough for me. It was covered in dark hair, and was looking at me through these dark, treacle-coloured eyes. But the worst part of it all, Missy, the worst part of it all, is he was carrying Turvey in his arms. I think he's going to eat Turvey, Missy. The creature was looking at me, but I refused to look back at it. I just couldn't. I turned around and ran. This thing was calling after me, shouting after me. I think it's going to eat Turvey. That's why my dog cried out. Oh, my God, poor Turvey. I can't imagine what he's going through. I've abandoned him, Missy. But I was too scared to face that Bigfoot. I just couldn't. Of course you couldn't. You were scared, Mrs. Beacon. You've had a dreadful shock. It took an awfully long time to console Mrs. Beacon, because she was inconsolable. I helped her to her feet and walked her home. When we arrived back at her cottage, I was absolutely stunned to see that Turvey was at the front door, limping badly on his back foot. Mrs. Beacon cried out in delight, running towards her dog, embracing her with a warm hug. "Oh, Turvey! Oh, you're alive! Goodness gracious, you're alive! I thought that thing had eaten you! I can't believe you're safely home again!" She was deliriously happy to be reunited with Turvey. A trip to the vet confirmed that little Turvey had sprained her paw and was going to be absolutely fine, which was a relief for Mrs. Beacon. After Mrs. Beacon's encounter with the Bigfoot, she simply refused to walk the dogs on the Silver Gorge Trail. 15 years later, in 15 years my children had become feisty, opinionated teenagers, always giving me a hard time, as teenagers are inclined to do. I didn't have a dog anymore, after Pip had sadly died. I was so heartbroken I couldn't bring myself to replace him, even though my children begged me to do so. Instead, we got a cat. Mrs. Beacon was a lot more resilient than I was. When Topsy and Turvey had passed away from the effects of old age, Mrs. Beacon was absolutely devastated by their demise. She couldn't bear to be alone, so she acquired 2 more schnauzers, which she called Rose and Poppy. She was devoted to the both of them, and would talk longingly about her wish to take them on the Silver Gorge Trail again. But she was terrified of encountering that Bigfoot, whom she believed might be loitering around the grove, and might grab one of her schnauzers and eat it. She certainly believed Turvey had been very lucky, and managed to escape the Bigfoot within an inch of her life. Instead, Mrs. Beacon would drive the dogs religiously to a doggy park, where she claimed they had a great time interacting with other dogs and owners alike. She had sworn me to secrecy about not telling any of the locals about her encounter with the Bigfoot on the Silver Gorge Trail, for she felt many might ridicule her about such a story. Mrs. Beacon's encounter with the Bigfoot had certainly had an impact on my life, making me both wary and reticent to ever go exploring the Silver Grove Trail at the back of my home, and I had forbidden my children to do the same, which was something they never understood. "Why don't you want us to play in the woods?" my son complained bitterly. "Everybody else in the neighbourhood goes in there. People walk their dogs there all the time. Why can't we go there?" "I would rather you don't go there, that's all," I said. "But you're pathetic, Mum. Why are you so overprotective? Anyone would think you would think something bad would happen to us in there. As if a mountain lion is going to grab us or something. What are you scared of?" "The woods can be dangerous, dear," I told my son. "You don't know what's out there, do you? I think it's better to be safe rather than sorry." For Mrs. Beacon's sake, I never told my children the reason why I didn't want them to go exploring in the woods. Because if I merely suggested that there might be a Bigfoot loitering around, it would have driven my children directly to the woods, hoping that they would encounter the idiosyncratic creature. I knew my son was absolutely fascinated by the subject of Bigfoot, and for a long time had been hooked on a program called Finding Bigfoot. The last thing I wanted to do was to encourage him to go out and explore, and if he had the foggiest idea that a Bigfoot had indeed been sighted close to our home by Mrs. Beacon, well, I don't think I'd have been able to stop the enthusiasm from burgeoning inside him to catch a sighting of the creature that he really wanted to believe existed. One day, my sister, who was going away for a couple of days for a much-needed extended break with her husband, practically begged me to take care of her 7-year-old son, Lucas. I was reluctant to agree to watch over my nephew, as you had to have eyes in the back of your head with that one. I was, of course, grateful for small mercies, as my own children had never been nearly as mischievous as he was. I felt sorry for my sister, having to put up with such a naughty child, who was always inviting trouble in his life, as if it was his new best friend. 6 months ago my sister had discovered Lucas playing with matches in her home, and he nearly brought the entire house down in flames. Luckily the fire brigade got to my sister's house in plenty of time, and successfully managed to contain the fire. They informed her she was incredibly lucky, that not only was the house spared, but that the fire had not ended up in a devastating tragedy. On another occasion, the highly mischievous Lucas was told by both of his parents not under any circumstances to go playing around in the garage, and he failed to listen. He got trapped inside my sister's old freezer, and for once the freezer was not on. Had it been, Lucas could have frozen to death, for it was a long time before my sister actually found him. Then only 3 weeks ago Lucas climbed onto a bus at a local bus stop at the bottom of my sister's street, where he managed to artfully persuade a rather dithery absent-minded old lady, who didn't exactly have her wits about her, to buy him a bus ticket. The driver was successfully duped. He assumed the old lady was in Lucas's company, and was his grandmother. So Lucas ended up far away from home, and was found in a toy shop in a nearby town, playing around with all the toys. My sister was in a desperate panic when she couldn't find Lucas anywhere. She thought he'd been abducted. Luckily the manager of the local toy store made inquiries and reported Lucas to the police, saying that a little boy had been asking for his mother. My sister went racing off to the store to pick her son up, devastated that she'd turned her back for a single minute, and he had sauntered out of the house like that. It came as no surprise to me that nobody had volunteered to take care of little Lucas while my sister and her husband went away. But I couldn't blame them for that, because he was such an unpredictable child. But I'm a very big softy as far as my sister's concerned, and I knew how much she desperately needed this break away from her kid. So against my better judgment, I agreed to watch over him for a couple of days. Don't get me wrong, Lucas is a delightful little boy, and people always warm to him. The trouble is, if you told him not to do something, it's like a green light for him to do the very thing you've asked him not to do. I had tried, with not a great deal of success, to keep Lucas busily preoccupied. He was currently sitting at the kitchen table, drawing with crayons on paper, but he was already growing decidedly bored, and began to distractedly play with his toy plane. "I'm bored, Auntie Missy. I'm so bored. There's nothing to do, and I don't want to draw any more. I don't even like drawing all that much." "I tell you what, if you're feeling bored, let's go out of doors for a second. I need to hang out the washing on the line. You can pass me the washing and I'll peg it up on the line. It'll be fun, and you'll help me enormously. You want to help me, don't you, Lucas?" "Do I have to? I don't want to hang washing on the line, and besides, I'm too short. I can't reach it." "You don't have to do anything you don't want to, Lucas. If you don't want to pass me the washing from the basket, that's fair enough. But you can watch me hanging out the washing on the line if you like, while you play with your toy plane." I said this because I knew I needed to keep my beady eyes pinned faithfully on that rambunctious ball of mischief that I didn't trust for a single second. My teenagers were indoors playing on their computers, and I knew that they would not be very good at looking after their cousin. They'd probably get easily distracted, and it would only take a second for him to wander off. Lucas very reluctantly followed me out of doors, wearing a hangdog expression on his face. He didn't look remotely amused. It really was a magnificently beautiful day, with the sky a cup of blue, and a generous sunshine sprinkled itself all over the yard. Lucas began to make the booming sounds of an aeroplane, as he pretended it was taking off into the sky. And for a moment, dare I say this, but he did seem to be rather enjoying himself. I believed the fresh air was doing him the world of good, and I'm sure he was taking pleasure in the warm sunshine that splashed itself over his face. Look at my aeroplane, Aunt Missy. It can fly very, very high. I can see that, Lucas, I said, smiling warmly at him. It's a very clever aeroplane, isn't it? Aeroplanes aren't clever, Aunt Missy. You say silly things at times. I began to steadily hang out all the washing on the line, which included some sheets and some clothes. I noticed that Lucas's curious gaze was now steadily fixed on the Silver Gorge woodgrove. I visibly sighed. The last thing I wanted was for Lucas to show any interest in those woods, especially after Mrs. Beacon had told me a while back about her scary Bigfoot encounter in there, and how little Turvey had potentially nearly ended up being eaten alive by the creature. I was not sure if his menu would extend to little boys like Lucas. Having said that, I doubted the Bigfoot would still be around, but you couldn't be too careful about such things, could you? Especially when it came to minding somebody else's child. Look, Auntie Missy, said Lucas, pointing towards the woods. Someone is watching us, Aunt Missy. There's a man in the woods over there. It might just be a dog walker, Lucas. Lots of people walk around in the woods on the Silver Gorge Trail. It's probably a rambler. It could even be a bird watcher. Dogs! I love dogs! You think somebody's walking their dog in the woodgrove, Auntie Missy? I want to see their dog. If I go into the woods, I can see their dog, can't I? Maybe you can, Lucas, but I'm sorry, you can't go into the woods. But why not, Auntie Missy? Because I said so. Please, Auntie Missy, I'll be good, I promise you. I just want to see the dog if there is one. I'm sorry, Lucas. I told your mum I would watch over you. So no, you can't go into those woods. But I like dogs, Aunt Missy. My mother's next-door neighbour, she's got 3 sausage dogs. I like sausage dogs the best. They look like hot dogs that you put in a bun. They're very long, and they've got nice ears. I really like them. Mummy says one day I can have a sausage dog when I'm older, if I promise to be good. I'm sure they're very nice dogs, Lucas. If you like dogs, I can get Mrs. Beacon to take you to the doggy park with her 2 schnauzers later. How about that? Will there be sausage dogs at the doggy park, Aunt Missy? Asked Lucas, sounding excited, his face lighting up like a Christmas tree. I don't see why not. I'm sure they have all kinds of breeds at the doggy park. And sausage dogs are a very popular breed, are they not? I tell you what I'll do. When we've finished hanging out these clothes on the line, I'll go indoors and give Mrs. Beacon a call. I'll find out when she's taking her 2 schnauzers, Poppy and Rosie, for a walk. You can go with her, I'm sure. She'd enjoy your company. But promise me if you go with Mrs. Beacon you'll behave yourself. Because if you do something silly, your mum will never forgive me. Do you understand, Lucas? Yes, Aunt Missy. I promise I'll be very good. I want to go to see the sausage dogs. I should have been a lot sharper on the uptake, and known by the fixated look on Lucas's face that he was secretly up to no good. He was staring at the woods rather ravenously, as if he was eager to go exploring on his own when my back was finally turned. You can't go into the woods, do you understand that, Lucas? If you do anything silly, you will not be going with Mrs. Beacon to the doggy park, and then you won't get to see any sausage dogs. Do you understand? Yes, Aunt Missy. I promise you I'll be good. Good, I'm glad to hear that. I don't even allow my own teenagers to go in there. So the last thing I'm going to do is allow you to go in there. But why not, Aunt Missy? Because it's not safe, that's why. Now let's go and call Mrs. Beacon, shall we, and ask about the doggy park. Yippee! Yippee! Lucas cried out, waving his model aeroplane around. I gathered my washing basket in my hands and assumed that Lucas was following me into the kitchen. But what I failed to realise is I'd left him standing by the washing line, completely absorbed in trying to fly his little toy plane. I retrieved my cell phone from the top of the kitchen counter and called Mrs. Beacon, and had quite a lengthy conversation with her. She said it would be an absolute delight for her to take little Lucas to the doggy park with her the following morning, and yes, there were plenty of sausage dogs there. Sadly, Mrs. Beacon had already taken her 2 schnauzers to the doggy park that morning, so she couldn't take Lucas that day. So I knew he'd be disappointed, but it just could not be helped. I'm just warning you, Mrs. Beacon. Lucas can be quite the handful. He's only 7.5. He gets up to all kinds of mischief. But he's staying with me for a couple of days. You'll need to keep your eyes pinned on him at all times, because he can so easily wander off if you're not paying attention. I thought I needed to warn you about that. I could tell you some stories about that boy that will blow your mind. He's always getting into mischief. It'll be a pleasure to take care of him, said Mrs. Beacon. Besides, I really love children. And you say he likes dogs? Yes, he loves them, especially sausage dogs. I imagine there are sausage dogs at the doggy park, are they not? They're his absolute favourite. Oh, you don't have to worry about that. Plenty of sausage dogs at the doggy park. So I think your nephew is going to be in his element. And there's a big dog there that I see every day. He looks like a huge teddy bear. He's got the most gentle nature. The children love him to bits. They circulate around him all the time. He's the size of a miniature pony, and I'm not exaggerating either. I asked the owner what breed of dog it was. Now, I forget at the moment. It was a Russian something. That's right, but I can't remember the full name of the breed. But nevertheless, it's a magnificently beautiful dog, and I know Lucas will adore him. His name is Fido. He sounds gorgeous, Mrs. Beacon. Thank you so much for helping me out. I'll see you in the morning. Did you hear that? Isn't it good news, Lucas? I'm so excited for you. Mrs. Beacon has agreed to take you tomorrow to the doggy park, and she says they've got lots of sausage dogs there, I said, disconnecting my call, and looking around the kitchen expecting to see my nephew looking up at me with excited eyes. But where was he? He'd vanished from my sight. This was so typical of him. My heart did a huge somersault. This was the quintessential reason I didn't want to look after my sister's child. It was a huge responsibility. You had to have eyes in the back of your head with him. He would just disappear in front of you, rather like the Invisible Man. Where had he got to? I began to call out for Lucas, but he was nowhere in the cottage. I thought for a moment he might be playing hide and seek, and was half expecting him to jump out at me and say, "Boo! Boo, Auntie Missy! I got you! I got you!" "This isn't funny, Lucas," I called out. "If you're hiding somewhere, you need to come out now, or you can't go to the doggy park." Unsettlingly, my words were met by an ominous silence. I wondered if Lucas was playing outdoors in the backyard, close to the washing line. Was he still engaged with his aeroplane? But as I entered the yard, he was nowhere to be seen, and my stomach lurched. I knew he had disobeyed me, and he must have gone off into the woods. I recalled the wistful expression on his face as he had stared longingly at the woods. My concerns were confirmed when I saw a corner of Lucas's shirt that he had been wearing had been ripped off and was dangling from a rusty nail in the wooden pole fence. He had crawled under the fence in our property and run directly into the woods. Would that child never listen? That boy was incorrigible. I even warned him that my children couldn't go into those woods because it wasn't safe in there. But still he refused to listen. My heart began to pound violently in my chest. My throat suddenly became scratchy and dry. I crawled under the wooden pole fence and made a straight beeline towards the woods, running as fast as I could. As I entered the trees, I saw a man standing there. I breathed a sigh of relief when I saw a child was with him. It was Lucas. But before I could reprimand Lucas for his insubordinate behaviour and apologise to the man, I gasped in abject astonishment when I realised the man that had been talking to Lucas was no other than Alex, my ex-fiancé, who had abandoned me 15 years before. What on earth was he doing here in the woods? In my opinion, he hadn't changed very much over the years. I thought he looked great, and instead of feeling angry and affronted by seeing him, all I wanted to do was to run into his arms, because I'd missed him so very much. "Alex!" I said. "Alex, is that you? Is that really you? What are you doing here in the woods?" "It is me, Missy. It's been a long time, hasn't it?" "You're telling me." "Alex, but why? I don't understand. Why?" "You mean why did I bog off 15 years ago? Is that what you want to know?" "Yes. Why? I don't understand. I never understood." "Because I was a bloody idiot, that's why, Missy." "You were afraid of getting married, weren't you?" And it's because of your mother, because of her long line of failed marriages. Is that why?
Yes, I'm afraid, Missy. I'm ashamed to admit it. You didn't deserve that. I should have explained, but I just couldn't do it. Is there someone else in your life now? Another man, perhaps?
There's never been anybody else but you, Alex. I thought you'd know that. You're the only man I've ever loved.
I feel exactly the same way about you, Missy. I've never met anybody like you, and I've missed you so very much.
I'm not exactly sure what words were exchanged between us, but there were many. We hugged each other impulsively. Many tears were shed. What were you doing in the woods? I quizzed him again. Anyone would think you were spying on me.
Well, I pretty much was spying on you. There's no other way to put it. I just wanted to make sure you were all right. My mother assured me over the years you were all doing fine. And she was giving you the money I sent for you and the children. I just wanted to make sure that everything was all right and see you with my own eyes so that I could be assured about that. But coming here today and watching you hanging out your washing on the line has made me all but realize what a dreadful old fool I've been.
I could have told you that a long time ago. It was the craziest thing ever, you walking away from us. We really needed you in our lives, Alex, but I suppose it's better late than never. Lucas was standing there grinning from ear to ear, saying, So you two know each other then? Yes, Lucas. Believe it or not, I know this man very well. His name is Alex. We go back a long time. I took Alex's hand in mine, and we walked steadily back to the house. But when I turned around, Lucas was gone. The little brat had done a disappearing act all over again. This was so typical of him. Oh, my God! I said, turning around to look at Alex. Where is Lucas? I thought he was following us. He's only gone and vanished again.
I thought he was with us, Alex agreed.
But he's not. He's only gone back into the woods. He's probably looking for somebody's dog to befriend. Goodness gracious me, that boy is driving me nuts. I can't wait for my sister to collect him in 2 days' time, because I've had about as much as I can take of that brat. We both made our way back to the woods and began to frantically search for little Lucas and earnestly call out his name. Lucas! Lucas, it's me, Aunt Missy! Where are you? We waited for a while and nothing happened, and I was becoming very distressed. And then coming through the trees all of a sudden, holding the hand of a Bigfoot, was Lucas himself. It was in that moment I nearly fainted on the spot. This was the kind of thing you'd expect to see in a children's fantasy book, but never in real life. I thought I would pass out and faint on the spot, but thankfully Alex gripped my hand firmly. Come back here at once, Lucas, I cried out, trying to ignore the Bigfoot. But I want to play with my hairy friend, said Lucas. The Bigfoot pushed Lucas forward very gently, so that the little boy reluctantly ran over to my side, not looking terribly pleased, of course. For a moment the Bigfoot's treacle-coloured eyes met mine, and I heard a voice in my head that I knew was not my own. The Bigfoot was communicating with me telepathically.
He's a naughty boy. I thought I ought to bring this little child back to safety.
I stared incredulously at this magnificent creature, hardly daring to believe what I was seeing with my naked eyes. I suspect this was the Bigfoot that Mrs. Beacon encountered 15 years earlier, and I realized, to my delight, that he was completely harmless. I imagine, far from wanting to eat little Turvey all those years ago, he'd probably rescued the distraught dog from a nasty fall. Mrs. Beacon, seeing Turvey in the Bigfoot's arms, had assumed the very worst. Isn't it funny how a formidable appearance can make us believe the worst in someone? My friend Alice has a fearsome-looking pit bull, and even her postman is terribly afraid to go near her gate because of her pit bull. And yet Rusty is the biggest teddy bear you can ever hope to meet. He is lovable in every sense of the word. I sensed that, rather like Rusty, this Bigfoot had obviously drawn the short end of the straw. People always assume a creature as formidable as this is going to naturally harm you. As I was meditating over these thoughts while looking at the Bigfoot was reading them. He answered me in my head and said, "You're all safe in these woods. I am the watcher. You're safer in the woods than you are in your own home.
because I am always watching."
And with that, he turned around and glided away. As you can imagine, I was quick to tell Mrs. Beacon about my bizarre experience with the Bigfoot.
"Goodness gracious me! And to think I thought the creature was going to eat Turvey! He was so desperately intimidating, Missy. You must understand that."
"But of course I understand that, Mrs. Beacon. You forget I saw him myself, and intimidating is certainly a word to describe him. But I think you misunderstood him, Mrs. Beacon. He intended to rescue Turvey, because Turvey was struggling to walk. I think your dog had a fall. He was carrying your dog. He had no intention of eating her. I'm sure he knew that Turvey was your pet. If you think about it, how did Turvey manage to escape a powerful creature's clutches like that? If the Bigfoot had wanted to eat Turvey, there is no way that Turvey would have safely returned home. Think about that for a moment."
"Now that you put it like that, dear, I think you might be right. What a fool I've been! How could I have misread everything so dreadfully badly?"
I am very glad to tell you that Mrs. Beacon resumed her dog-walking activity in the Silver Gorge woods, although she occasionally took her dogs to the doggy park. Lucas returned home to tell his mother that he had met a very nice bear man in the woods. But my sister thought her child had a furtive imagination, and I certainly chose not to elaborate. As for me and Alex, we made up for lost time in a big way, and believe it or not, Alex got over his fear of getting married, so we both did tie the knot. My teenagers loved meeting their biological father, but no one is angry with Alex for running away from getting married, because we understood he had issues that he needed to sort out. But at the end of the day, we found each other again, and that's all that matters. As for my little nephew, naughty little Nucas remains as mischievous as ever, but then what can you expect from a boy like that? So there you are, that's my story.
What an incredible story! I hope you all enjoyed that as much as I did. Until next time, goodbye and good night.